In this video, I'm going to show you how to use reverb. I'm going to go over what reverb is, the different types of reverbs, the basic parameters of reverb, and an example of how to apply reverb to your track. So let's get started. What is up, everyone? I am Daniel and I am the founder of SOUNDSHOCK Audio, a site dedicated to the modern music producer. For those of you who don't know, I release tutorials every week, so if you want to learn all things electronic music production when it comes to mixing, mastering, sound design, and arrangement, go ahead and click the subscribe button and the bell notification next to it so you don't miss when I release a new video. We have all heard of reverb before, and many of us are even using it in our tracks right now. But a lot of producers are unsure about the different types of parameters, the different types of reverbs, and really how to apply it to your song in a positive way to achieve a more professional sounding mix. So that's what we're gonna go over in this video. So what is reverb? Reverb or reverberation is the way that sound waves reflect off various surfaces before reaching the listener's ear. Reverb is composed of a series of tightly spaced echoes that are heard as a single sound. The number of echoes and the way that they decay play a major role in shaping the sound that you hear as reverb. Many factors influence the sound of a reverberated space. These include the dimensions of the actual space, the length, the width, and the height, what the space is made out of, the walls, the carpet, what the ceiling is made out of, and diffusion, which is what the sound bounces off of. So in any space, we hear the sound plus the reverb, and it's always the direct sound first, followed by the reverberated wash of energy as it decays to silence. Now, why would we want to use reverb in our mix? Reverb provides a way to add space, depth, and glue to your mix, which is a key component of getting a professional sounding mix. Reverb also gives very important clues to the listener on where the sound is taking place and where the listener is in relation to the sound. So our ears are always used to hearing reverb. Every sound that we hear has some sort of reverb on it, whether that be a very small, short, unnoticeable reverb or a very long, pronounced tail of reverb. So really leaving reverb off any sound would seem unnatural. Now we're going to go over the basic parameters of a reverb effect. Now, these aren't the only parameters on a reverb effect. I just want to go over the very basic ones, and so you have an understanding of how to apply reverb right after watching this. The first parameter is the dry-wet. This is the amount of the dry and reverberated sound in your mix. Next is the decay or time of your reverb. This determines how long it takes for the reflections in the room to run out of energy and become inaudible. Next is the pre-delay. This is the time between the end of the initial sound and the beginning of the first reflections being audible. This will give your mix a little more transparency by leaving some space between the original sound and its reverb. So if you don't want your sound to be completely washed away, then add a little pre-delay. Also, using the pre-delay will give the feeling of a bigger space. Now let's go over the 4 most common types of reverbs and what type of elements these reverbs sound best on. The first type is a room reverb. These reverbs are designed to simulate the natural sound of an acoustic space. In general, a room reverb operates under 1 second of decay time and make up a majority of the natural sounding reverb that you might hear. Room reverbs can be anything from a closet to a gymnasium. A room reverb is good for adding realism to instruments, so adding them to most of your dry sounding elements in your song would work well, especially with your synthesizers, which could use a bit more realism added to its synthetic character. Next up is the hall reverb. This is one of the most common types of reverbs and are designed to produce effects produced by large halls. Hall reverb decay times usually last from 1.2 seconds to 4 seconds and give your sound a large, spacious, thick sound with the higher frequencies sounding duller. This reverb is great for getting a three-dimensional sound and filling out your mix without crowding the foreground. Be careful here, as too much of this reverb can cause your mix to sound distant and washed out. Elements that work well with hall reverbs applied to them include pads, strings, vocals, and other instruments that you want to take up a large amount of space in the mix. I would avoid percussion instruments here. Next up is the chamber reverb. These reverbs were originally designed for orchestras. They are very similar to hall reverbs, except they are a little bit of a smaller space. The decay or time of this reverb is around 0.5 seconds to 2 seconds. Chamber reverbs are good to use if you want to add a clear, large, and lush space to your sound without being overpowering like hall reverbs can be at times. As with hall reverbs, be careful not to add too much chamber reverb to your sounds, as this will wash away your mix and make it sound distant. Elements that work well with chamber reverbs applied to them include synths, strings, and vocals, and any other instruments that you want to take up more of a larger space in the mix, but not as large as a hall reverb and a little bit clearer. And again, I would avoid percussion and drum instruments here. And last, we have the plate reverb. This is a man-made reverb where transducers send and receive a signal through a sheet of metal. Plate reverbs sound similar to hall reverbs, but usually sound flatter or two-dimensional, as opposed to halls, which sound more three-dimensional. Plate reverb is great for adding length and size to a sound without making it sound distant or small, because they don't add depth or distance like a hall reverb does. So if you want your sounds to have a full, thick reverb sound on, but still keep your elements in the front of the mix, then add a plate reverb. Great instruments to add plate reverb to would be the vocals, drums, and real instruments. And you'll want to be careful here as well, as adding too much of this plate reverb to your mix will leave it sounding flat. So remember, experimentation is key here. So don't feel that you should be only using one type of reverb for specific sounds. Now let's go over an example where I apply reverb to a dry sounding track so you guys can understand how to apply reverb to your own mix. This track has no reverb on any of its instruments and it's going to sound very dry. Then once we have the playthrough, we're going to go over how to apply reverb. So as you can hear, the track is very dry. There is no real depth in it. So now we're going to want to apply reverb here. Now there are a few techniques for applying reverb to your track. You could of course add reverb to each individual sound. You could load up a reverb plugin on the track of individual instruments, but that is very CPU heavy. So what I like to do is I like to add return/send tracks and then add reverbs this way. That way you're only using one instance of the plugin, and you can send the sound to this reverb without having to use multiple instances of the reverb plugin. So every DAW is going to have return and send channels that you could route other tracks to. So this technique is applicable to any DAW, and not just Ableton. So in Ableton, the return and sends are down here, and to send audio to these returns and sends, you just turn up the volume here. So this goes to A, the hall reverb, and then B, that goes to the room reverb, and then C, that goes to the plate reverb, and then D, that goes to the chamber reverb. Another reason I like to use this return and send for my reverbs is to have more of a cohesive space. If I only have 3 or 4 reverbs running at one time, that means I'm loading multiple instruments into the same reverb and putting it in a specific space, rather than having a bunch of different reverb plugins with a bunch of different settings on different instruments. This helps just glue the mix together a little bit better. So I'm going to go ahead and go over each individual reverb, the hall, the room, the plate, and the chamber. I'm going to go over the settings that I give it, and then we're going to apply it to individual instruments. So when I'm in the mixing phase, I always like to set up these 4 reverbs, and then start applying the reverb to the individual sounds. Okay, so let's go over the first reverb, and that is the hall reverb. Now for this tutorial, I'm going to be using the Waves IRL reverb. The reason I chose this reverb for the tutorial is it has very simple controls and it has a nice graphic display for you guys to understand what is going on with the reverb. All your reverb plugins are going to have these basic controls that the IR Live has, so don't worry about this having extra features. And if you guys are looking for great free reverb plugins, I have put a link to the description to soundshocaudio.com where you can find the best free reverb plugins out right now. So with the hall reverb, this reverb is once again to add a 3-dimensional large and lush sound to our mix. So our pre-delay, we're going to want this all the way down, as we want the sound to really fill out. We really want the space to shine through here and not the original sound. And once again, the pre-delay is how long it takes for the reverb to start playing. As you can see here, that it would be the initial sound, 168 milliseconds in between there, and then the reverb would come in. And then next, we want the reverb time to be around 3 seconds, as we want it to be a fairly long tail. And this is the tail right here, or decay of the reverb. You can see what it looked like with the shorter decay. And then the dry wet is always going to be at 100%. When you put your reverb on your returns and sends, you're going to want to have the dry wet up to 100%, as you want to be applying 100% of the affected signal. If you have this plugin on an individual track, then you are going to want to have it down lower. So once again, with your reverbs, you're going to want to have 100% dry wet on the bus return / send channel. And then finally, we have a little bit of EQing on this reverb. Most reverb plugins are going to have this EQ, and this is a very basic EQ. And we have just taken out some of the low frequencies, as we don't want to muddy up our mix here. This is a large reverb, so keeping the low end under control is important. And then we have just rolled off a little bit of the high frequencies here, as we don't want too much shimmer in this reverb. We want it to sit a little bit in the background. So that's going to be the hall reverb, and then our room reverb. And for the pre-delay, I have set it to around 48 milliseconds, as I want the initial sound to come through a little bit first, and then have the reverb come in. Room reverbs have fairly short to medium decay times, and I left it at 1.84 milliseconds here, as we don't want too much of a splash with this reverb. Setting up very high will cloudy up the mix. And once again, the dry wet is at 100%. And the EQ here, it's a very similar EQ curve to the hall reverb. We have removed the lower frequencies so it doesn't cloudy up the mix. And we have boosted the high frequencies, as we want this reverb to come through more in the mix. And then next is the plate reverb. Once again, this plate is good for adding a big lush sound without overpowering the mix and keeping it a little more under control. So we've moved the pre-delay up to around 62 milliseconds here, once again to let the initial sound come through before the reverb starts playing. And then we have a 0.89 second decay time for this plate reverb, as plate reverbs are fairly short reverb times. That is the range it seems to work well. Having a very long decay time here will wash out the sound, and having a very short decay time here, it will seem fairly inaudible and not give the mix the depth that we want. In the dry wet at 100% again, and then the EQ curve is once again very similar. We want this to come through in the mix, and we don't want to cloudy it up, muddy it up. So we've removed some of the low frequencies and boosted the high frequencies. And then finally, we have the chamber reverb. Again, the chamber reverb is similar to the hall reverb, but is not quite as large and powerful as the hall reverb. And since we didn't want to completely drown out our sounds, we have chose to use a 18 milliseconds pre-delay here, as opposed to the hall reverb, which we had 0 pre-delay, which immediately started affecting the sound. And then we have the reverb time at 2 seconds here, as chambers are again a large space. The dry wet at 100%, and once again removing frequencies from the low end and boosting the high for the shimmer. So now let's start adding these 4 reverbs to our instruments. Now when adding reverb, I like to add enough reverb so it sounds just noticeable in the mix. It can be very easy to get carried away with the amount of reverb that you apply. So always bring it back a little bit and just have it barely noticeable. That way you avoid clouding up your mix while adding a depth, space, and glue to your mix. So let's start with our drums here. Let's have a listen to the fullest part of the mix. So we have 4 options here on which reverbs to use. Now for drums, I like to use a room reverb. For hall and chamber reverbs, this would not work that well as they are very large, lush, and would take away some of the transients and really cloudy up the mix. So I'd rule out hall and chamber reverbs for your drums. Now, plate reverb would work well on your drums, but I'm going for a little more of a smaller sound here. Not quite as lush, not quite as large. Let's go ahead and add the room reverb. And once again, all your DAWs are going to have this. It might not look quite like this, but you will be able to add each individual track to your specific return and send channels. So let's start adding. So there you can hear the reverb. And you can hear the little pre-delay that we added to this room, which is good for the drums specifically, as we want to have the transients come through first before it gets washed away. We want the drums to be nice and punchy. So let's go ahead and reel it back here. So around negative 24 decibels, you can barely hear it, and it does give it a little bit of space here. Next up is our synths. So in deciding what type of reverb to use on your synths, you're gonna wanna listen to the synth group together and decide where the different elements should lie. Should they sit more in the background? Should they sit more in the foreground? Should they have more space? Should they have less space? So let's listen to the synths soloed. Okay, so let's first start with the pad. The pad is a background instrument here. We want this instrument to be in the background and take up a lot of space, so a hall reverb is great here. It'll give it more of a three-dimensional sound while keeping it in the background. So let's go ahead and add the hall reverb to the pad. So as you can hear, the hall reverb gives the pad more height while keeping it in the background. Next, let's go over the pluck. So this is a supporting sound. It is not the main lead pluck. So we want it to take up a lot of space in the mix, but not be too much in the background here. So a good choice for this pluck is the chamber reverb. We want to give it space, but we don't want to give it a complete washed out sound like we have for the pad. So let's start adding the chamber reverb to the supporting pluck here. There we go, it gives it more height, more width, while still being a bit in the foreground of the mix. Next, let's go on over to the lead pluck. Since this lead is at the very front mix, this is what we want the listener to pay attention to the most. We don't want to drown away the sound, and we want to keep it fairly in the foreground, but have a large space. The plate reverb is perfect for this, as a plate reverb gives more of a two-dimensional sound. So it'll keep the pluck in the foreground while giving it a lot of depth. As you can hear, a nice space to the sound. And the last element that we're going to add reverb to is the bass. So a lot of producers will say not to add a reverb to your bass. But in all our reverbs, we have removed the low frequencies. Once again, all sounds in the natural world have reverb, and the ones that don't have reverb seem unnatural. So as long as you're removing low frequencies from your reverbs, it is okay to add reverb to your basses. And since we don't want a very long tail to muddy up the mix, we're gonna choose a shorter reverb, the room reverb here. So we'll usually keep bass reverbs fairly short with a good amount of pre-delay, so they give depth without causing any problems in the mix. So we have now added reverb to all the main instruments that we want to add reverb to. The sub, we'd never add any reverb to this, as adding reverb to any sub frequencies would just muddy up the mix. So that is the only area you want to avoid adding reverb to. And the effects, the samples that we use already had a reverb on them. So let's go ahead and listen to the mix without the reverbs on and then with. And this is without. And then with. So there's a lot more depth, the mix seems wider, the elements sound more glued together, and it is a more professional sounding mix with the reverbs that we used. So it's important to note that when you're mixing your reverbs, you're going to want to go back into the individual sounds and adjust the amounts of reverb that you used to fit your track with all the instruments playing. So for example, the lead synth sounds a little bit too washed out, so we're going to go ahead and adjust that again. So there you guys go. That is the technique that I like to use for adding reverb to my mixes. Thank you so much for sticking around and watching this video. If you guys have any questions about the video, go ahead and put them in the comments below. Also, I would love to hear how you guys apply reverb to your own songs. I know there are many other techniques out there, so go ahead and throw those in the comments as well. I know many of you are already using reverb in your tracks, and I'd love to hear how you guys use them. So go ahead and let me know in the comments how you guys use your reverb plugins. And before I let you guys go, I just want to let you know that I have added 120 new free plugins to SOUNDSHOCKaudio.com. So you guys will definitely want to head on over to the site and get to downloading, as I've got all different types of plugins on the site on there for you guys. And if you guys want to learn more about music production when it comes to mixing, mastering, sound design, and arrangement, go ahead and hit the subscribe button right here. Until the next tutorial, everyone.